In 1995, Acura made a decision that went against everything it had just proven. It discontinued the Legend. For a decade, the Legend had shown that a Japanese sedan could compete directly with European and American luxury, not just on reliability, but on desirability. The market had shifted because of it. Buyers who once only considered Mercedes-Benz or Cadillac were now taking Acura seriously, seeing it as a modern alternative to the traditional luxury brands. But even as the Legend reached its peak influence, a replacement was already in development for the 1996 model year. Honda's engineers were tasked with building something more advanced in every measurable way. The goal was clear: build a car that would feel the same in its 20th year as it did on its first day. Durability over cost, perfection over profit. Then the car arrived, and for North American buyers, something had changed. The Legend name was gone. In its place was the RL. On paper, the engineering had improved, but the car had lost its soul. So what happens when a car becomes more advanced in every measurable way, but harder for people to care about? To understand that, you have to look at the moment when perception began to matter more than the machine itself. In 1986, Honda made an audacious decision. The company created Acura as a completely separate luxury brand, positioned directly against Mercedes-Benz and BMW on American soil. This wasn't a premium trim package slapped onto existing cars. This was an entirely different channel with a different vision, aimed at buyers who thought differently. When the first Legend arrived that same year, it changed the conversation immediately. It used front-wheel drive at a time when the luxury establishment insisted rear-wheel drive was the only acceptable choice. It featured a V6 while competitors claimed you needed 8 cylinders to be prestigious. Yet the cabin was quieter than a Mercedes, and the car cost less than a BMW 5 Series. Acura had proved that Japanese engineering could define luxury without imitating European designs. But the car that really mattered arrived in 1991. The second-generation Legend had sharper lines, a more aggressive stance, and a personality that felt intentional. This car looked like it wanted to be driven. The suspension responded to steering input with weight and purpose. A manual transmission was available, reinforcing the idea that this was luxury for people who actually enjoyed the act of driving. By the middle of the decade, the Legend had done something rare. It had attracted buyers from two completely different worlds. Luxury buyers took the brand seriously, enthusiasts appreciated the engineering. Owner surveys placed it at the very top of their respective categories. The Legend had become synonymous with Acura itself. Then the market shifted. Toyota and Nissan launched Lexus and Infiniti in 1989, but those early years felt cautious. By the mid-1990s, both brands were building dedicated platforms with massive engineering budgets. The full-size flagship sedan became the primary battleground where brand positioning was determined. This was where prestige was defined, where wealthy buyers decided which nameplate they would remain loyal to for the next decade. Honda's engineering leadership saw what was coming. The directive they gave was unambiguous. They wanted to build something more refined than anything the company had ever produced. They wanted to exceed the Lexus, not merely match it. The Legend was still selling well, but the architecture was aging. Honda realized they didn't need a refreshed version of the old car. They needed something entirely new. A dedicated flagship platform built around a singular principle, a philosophy that cost did not matter, only perfection. The engineers at Honda faced a fundamental choice, and they rejected the obvious path. While Lexus and Infiniti were pouring billions into new platforms built around V8 engines and rear-wheel drive architectures, Acura decided to stay with a V6. To the accountants watching from the sidelines, this looked like a compromise. But the engineers understood something those spreadsheets could never capture. A V8 is inherently loud. Its vibrations travel through the chassis. Its sheer complexity creates friction at every junction. A V8 flagship is, by its very nature, a shouting car. Acura wanted the opposite. They wanted a machine that disappeared. To achieve this, they made a structural decision that would cost millions in development. The new engine would be mounted longitudinally rather than transversely. In a front-wheel drive car, this was completely unconventional. Most manufacturers mounted their engines perpendicular to the direction of travel to simplify manufacturing and maximize interior space. But Honda had already used this technique on the previous Legend, and they understood the physical benefits it provided. When an engine sits longitudinally, the weight distribution of the entire vehicle improves dramatically. The mass of the engine moves behind the front axle, resulting in a 56-44 front-to-rear weight split. This balance provided immense stability during highway cruising and reduced understeer during cornering, finally eliminating the nose-heavy feeling that plagued almost every other front-wheel drive luxury car. The longitudinal layout also allowed the front wheels more room to turn, which meant parking an expensive car in tight urban streets no longer required the spatial awareness of a professional driver. Inside the engine block, the commitment went even deeper. The connecting rods were block forged, a manufacturing process that cost exponentially more than standard casting, but it created internal geometry optimized for strength rather than speed of production. The crankshaft was also forged for durability, and a balance shaft was added whose only purpose was to cancel out secondary vibrations that no human could consciously hear. The cylinder block itself was made of aluminum with cast-in iron liners, providing the light weight of aluminum with the thermal stability of iron. Every main bearing journal had been reinforced with additional metal, and the crankcase featured extensive webbing. These were not features designed to increase horsepower, they were engineered to decrease vibration at the source. The C35A produced 210 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute, delivering maximum torque of 224 pound-feet at just 2,800 revolutions per minute. This was a deliberate engineering choice to create a flat, broad power curve that felt effortless rather than aggressive. The engine used a variable induction system instead of the theatrical valve lift changes of a performance VTEC engine. The VIS employed a dual-stage intake manifold that shifted between low and high RPM efficiency, making the power delivery completely transparent to the driver. There was no sensation of the engine waking up or delivering a surge. The power simply arrived, evenly distributed across the RPM range, appropriate to a luxury sedan designed to feel like a machine that never announced its effort. The commitment extended far beyond the powertrain. Honda applied a 5-coat paint process to the exterior, even though standard automotive practice called for 2 or 3 coats. This required precision and cost discipline, but it created a depth of color and resistance that preserved the car's appearance for decades. The chassis itself was over-engineered beyond what contemporary competitors would attempt. Additional bracing was welded into areas that would never experience stress, and every measurement of torsional and bending rigidity was optimized for stability. These were the final years of the bubble era, which meant cost considerations were secondary to engineering goals. The directive from leadership was absolute perfection, not profit. And then, the entire philosophy was about to be rendered invisible by a single corporate choice. But even the most perfect machine requires a name that people can believe in. The engineering was complete, the car was ready. And then, someone in the marketing department made a decision that would reshape the brand's entire future. Acura's leadership looked at their product line and saw what they perceived as a problem. The Legend name had become more valuable than the Acura brand itself. When someone owned an Acura Legend, they didn't say they drove an Acura, they simply said they drove a Legend. The same pattern had emerged with the Integra, where the model name had accumulated all the prestige while the brand remained relatively unknown compared to Lexus or Infiniti. The solution was radical: rebrand the entire lineup using alphanumeric designations. The Legend would become the RL, standing for Road Luxury. The TL would represent Type Luxury, the CL would be Coupe Luxury. These names were standardized and professional, but more importantly, they forced customers to say the brand name first. An RL owner had to say Acura RL, putting the brand before the product. On paper, this logic was sound. In the market, it was catastrophic. The Legend name carried a decade of carefully constructed prestige. It signaled achievement, reliability, and thoughtful engineering to everyone who saw it. The name had been featured in magazines and discussed in owner forums for years. It was a marketing asset worth millions of dollars, and Acura was about to abandon it. The RL felt sterile by comparison. It sounded like a tire specification or a piece of audio equipment. It required constant explanation. When people asked what you drove, you couldn't simply say RL. you had to say Acura RL. And if they didn't know what that was, you had to explain that it replaced the legend. That explanation stripped away every ounce of emotional weight the transaction had carried. What made this worse was the timing. This rebranding occurred exactly when Lexus was executing one of the most effective marketing strategies in automotive history. They filmed champagne glasses stacked up in a pyramid on the hood of an LS400. As the car reached high speeds, not a single drop spilled. It was a visual metaphor for smoothness that anyone could understand in 30 seconds. Meanwhile, Acura was positioned to explain something far more abstract and technical. They had to talk about longitudinal engine mounting, weight distribution ratios, and acoustic properties of balance shafts. These were genuine technical advantages, but they were invisible to the average consumer. You can't show someone structural rigidity in a commercial, and you can't make a 30-second spot about forged connecting rods and feel anything other than lost. The market had already decided what luxury meant. V8 displacement and rear-wheel drive architecture. Prestige that didn't require explanation at a dinner party. Acura was positioned not to celebrate its engineering, but to defend it. While Acura was busy explaining its structural choices, Lexus was busy selling the dream of a rival. Before we look at how Lexus dominated, consider this. If you own a car from this era, does it have a name or a number? That choice, the moment Acura abandoned legend for RL, may have been the single largest marketing mistake in the company's history. The Lexus LS400 arrived in 1995. As something more than just a car, it was proof of concept. Toyota had spent 5 years and invested staggering resources to chase a standard of perfection that felt almost obsessive. The engineers had reshaped the interior 17 times before the final design was approved. But all of that mechanical effort served a very specific strategic goal. Toyota understood a fundamental truth about the luxury segment that Honda's engineers had missed. The buyer isn't purchasing a list of mechanical specifications. Instead, the customer is purchasing a narrative about who they are and what they have achieved. The LS400 offered exactly that narrative. It was positioned as the car for people who had already won. Not people who were building their success, but people who had already arrived. The engineering specifications supported this positioning perfectly. V8 engine producing 260 horsepower, rear-wheel drive architecture, which had been the gold standard for luxury since Mercedes first established the segment in the 1950s. A suspension tuned for isolation rather than engagement, absorbing every impact with deliberate, cloud-like softness. Everything communicated a single message with absolute clarity: you have made it. The V8 became the universal symbol of American luxury almost by accident. It was louder, required more maintenance, consumed more fuel than smaller alternatives. It was less efficient in every measurable way, but it signaled abundance. In the language of luxury, abundance is the very foundation of restraint. Only the wealthy can afford to have more of something than they actually need. A V8 proved you had money to spare. The Acura RL possessed technical advantages that no owner could ever perceive. The weight distribution was superior. The engine was quieter. The structural rigidity was greater. The steering feel was more precise because there was no front-wheel drive torque steer to manage. Period road tests from Car and Driver and Road and Track confirmed that the RL was an excellent machine. Reviewers consistently praised the electric power steering and the smoothness of the VTEC V6. Yet those same reviewers struggled to explain why the RL felt fundamentally different from its competitors. They couldn't articulate it because the differences weren't dramatic. They were invisible. A longitudinal engine layout doesn't create a sensation you feel immediately. A 56-44 weight distribution doesn't announce itself through the steering wheel. Forged connecting rods and a balance shaft, canceling secondary vibrations, are things you don't hear or feel, which was precisely the point. The Acura was designed to disappear into refinement. The market narrative had been predetermined before either car even arrived. Lexus positioned itself as the brand for people who had achieved success. Acura attempted to position itself as the brand for people who understood engineering deeply enough to recognize superiority without obvious signs. One narrative invoked status, the other invoked intelligence. One made buyers feel like winners. The other asked buyers to believe in data they couldn't perceive. In the world of luxury, status triumphs over intelligence with remarkable consistency. Buyers didn't want to be smart. They wanted to be important. The LS400 delivered that feeling in every interaction. The RL delivered something more subtle and more durable, but subtlety has never been a luxury market strength. The design of the new RL was about to compound this narrative problem in ways that made the gap even wider. This philosophical gap wasn't just visible in the sales charts. It was baked into the very way the cars were designed to move. The second-generation Legend had arrived in 1991 with a very specific purpose. The body lines were angular and deliberate. The suspension was tuned to respond to steering input with weight and feedback. The car felt like it wanted to be driven, not merely occupied. A manual transmission was available, reinforcing the idea that this was luxury for people who actively enjoyed the road. The new RL represented a completely different philosophy. Acura's product planners understood they were no longer competing for the same buyer as the Legend had attracted. The RL was designed for isolation. The suspension was double wishbone at all four corners, technically superior to the McPherson struts used by competitors, but it was tuned for a wafting, cushioned ride. The steering was lighter. The overall character was one of separation from the road rather than connection to it. This was not bad engineering. It was a different choice entirely. The suspension geometry was identical in both cases, but the difference lay in the spring rates, the damper calibration, and the roll stiffness. These tuning choices were intentional, reflecting a deliberate shift toward what Acura's product planners believed the American luxury market wanted. The Legend had been a driver's car that happened to be luxurious. The RL was a luxury car that happened to be drivable. What Acura attempted to compensate for was interior craftsmanship. The leather was thick and supple, hand-finished by people with actual skill who selected and treated each hide individually. The wood trim was genuine, not a photographic overlay on plastic. The buttons operated with weighted precision that signaled quality through tactile feedback alone. The design language was timeless, ensuring these materials would not become dated, but would instead develop a patina that suggested permanence. The Lexus took a different approach entirely. Their interior was oriented toward the showroom. Electroluminescent gauges made the dashboard glow. Cutting-edge infotainment systems made the cabin feel like the future. Every element was designed to impress at first sight, to signal technological advancement and contemporary sophistication. The philosophical difference was absolute. The Lexus interior said, "I am new, I am advanced, I am ahead of you." The Acura interior said, "I will age well, my materials will improve, my construction will still be perfect in 20 years. One strategy worked for 1996. The other only began to make sense a decade later, when the Lexus's electroluminescent gauges had become dated and the Acura's hand-finished leather was just beginning to develop character. By the late 1990s, the sales gap was obvious. Lexus was selling to buyers who wanted to make a statement about their arrival. Acura was selling to buyers who understood manufacturing quality deeply enough to recognize it without advertising. These were not incompatible buyer profiles, but they operated at vastly different volumes. The Lexus LS400 commanded prices that the RL could not reach. As the market rendered its judgment through depreciation curves and residual values, the hierarchy became permanent. Acura had traded the Legend's approachability for corporate refinement, and in doing so, had eliminated the emotional connection that had made the original car work. The company would attempt to address this image problem with updates and revisions, but some damage, once done, cannot be undone through engineering alone. In 1999, Acura made its first genuine effort to arrest the RL's decline. The engineers stiffened the chassis with additional bracing and reinforcements to improve composure at highway speeds. High-intensity discharge headlights became standard across the lineup, a bold move when that technology was rare and expensive in the luxury segment. The team refined aerodynamics, bringing the drag coefficient down to 0.32 from the original 0.34. Spring rates and damper calibration were adjusted to give the car a firmer, more European feel on the road. By any measure, this refreshed RL was mechanically superior to the 1996 original. It addressed the criticisms from early road tests directly. It was the car Acura should have built from the start, but the fundamental architecture hadn't changed. It was still a front-wheel drive sedan powered by a V6. The positioning remained stuck in limbo, and critically, the name stayed exactly the same. This was the vulnerability Acura simply couldn't overcome. A mid-cycle facelift can extend a car's commercial life, but it cannot fix a broken brand narrative or reshape how buyers perceive a flagship. The marketing department continued pushing road luxury, a concept that meant nothing to someone ready to spend $50,000. The RL wasn't a destination. It was a logical choice for people who had already decided they wanted an Acura. By 1999, most buyers in that bracket had chosen otherwise. Then, in 2001, Lexus released the LS400. This wasn't a minor refresh. The new Lexus featured a substantially revised V8 that had grown to 4.3 liters, producing 290 horsepower. The interior was completely overhauled. The suspension received new damping and refined geometry. The styling remained evolutionary, but it looked significantly sharper and more modern than the aging LS400 it replaced. From a competitive standpoint, the timing was devastating for the RL. The technology advantages Acura had once held, speed-sensitive hydraulic steering calibration, factory navigation, were now being matched by the updated Lexus. The RL had entered the market with innovations that claimed sophistication, but by the early 2000s, those features had become standard across the industry. What was once a unique selling point was now just the bare minimum required to compete. The years between 2002 and 2004 were the most difficult in the KA9's production run. Sales dropped every single year. Buyer satisfaction surveys showed a massive gap opening in favor of Lexus. The residual values of the two cars drifted so far apart that a 3-year-old RL was worth substantially less than a 3-year-old LS430, even though they had cost roughly the same when new. Acura wouldn't have a real answer until the second-generation RL arrived in 2005. That car introduced SHAWD torque vectoring, which distributed power independently between the rear wheels to improve cornering dynamics. It was a genuine engineering leap, but by then the damage was irreversible. The hierarchy of the luxury market was permanent. Acura had lost the conversation forever. Time has a way of stripping away marketing hype, leaving behind only the cold reality of the machine itself. If you spend time on collector car forums today, you'll notice something striking. The Lexus LS400 gets featured in restoration projects and enthusiast publications. Well-maintained examples command price premiums that far exceed their original cost. The car has become a modern masterpiece in the eyes of people who care deeply about automotive engineering. The Acura RL lives in a completely different world. It survives on the roads, but not because people sought it out or wanted to preserve it. It survives for a practical reason that has almost nothing to do with its status as a luxury icon. The KA9 platform itself was a dedicated, bespoke chassis, a lonely masterpiece that Honda would never build again. But the C35A engine shared ancestry with the Accord and Odyssey 5.6, which meant every local shop understood the powertrain. The 4-speed automatic appeared in other Honda products. This hybrid approach kept the RL affordable to maintain, even as the platform's complexity demanded respect. The RL didn't survive because it was embraced. It survived because it was economical to keep running. The irony was complete. A car engineered for permanence lived on through practical necessity, not prestige. The speed-sensitive hydraulic steering system remained the primary unique component without cross-platform equivalents. But even that became manageable over time. Remanufactured EPS racks entered the aftermarket supply chain, and shops that dealt with high-mileage vehicles learned the diagnostic procedures. The RL's survival wasn't about people wanting to preserve a masterpiece. It was about the car being incredibly cheap and easy to keep running. The current market value tells the story with brutal honesty. A clean, functional Acura RL from the late 90s sells for somewhere between $2,000 and $6,000 today. That's standard depreciation for an old luxury car with no special recognition or collector premium. To most people, the car is just reliable transportation that happens to be a bit quieter than a Civic. But if you actually get behind the wheel of one, you'll discover something that doesn't appear on any sales chart. You feel it in the heavy thud of the door closing and the way the engine vanishes into total silence at a red light. At highway speeds, the cabin remains remarkably still. The steering responds with precision that lacks the torque steer of a typical front-wheel drive car. The structural rigidity is so high that the entire chassis feels like one solid piece rather than a collection of vibrating components. These aren't things a marketing team can easily sell. They're physical sensations that belong to an era when the directive was clear: perfection, not profit. These were choices made by engineers who believed a car should outlast its owner's patience, not because it would make the company more money, but because that's what luxury meant. The Lexus LS400 won and became the symbol of its era. The Acura RL faded into obscurity. But for the few people who understand that the things you can't see often matter most, the RL remains the final artifact of a manufacturing philosophy that no longer exists. It's a car built for permanence in a world that had already decided to embrace disposability. The KA9 Acura RL documents a specific moment when the luxury market chose narrative over substance. The car arrived with genuine technical advantages: electric power steering, near-perfect weight distribution, acoustic engineering that eliminated vibrations most people couldn't consciously hear. None of these advantages mattered. The market had already decided what luxury meant, and it was measured in cylinder count and historical architecture, not in the invisible refinements that made one car meaningfully better than another. The Lexus LS400 wasn't necessarily more sophisticated on paper. It was louder, more complex, less efficient. But it told a simpler story. You drive this car because you have arrived. You drive this car because Mercedes and BMW have always built this way, and Lexus learned from them. The narrative was instantaneous. Everyone understood what the LS400 represented the moment they saw it. The Acura RL required explanation. It required buyers to understand what a longitudinal V6 layout accomplished, what a 56-44 weight distribution meant, why forged components mattered. These were legitimate advantages. Period road tests confirmed it. But luxury buyers at the $40,000 to $50,000 price point in the 1990s weren't shopping for legitimacy. They were shopping for perception. They wanted to feel important when they drove, not informed. This wasn't a failure of engineering. It was a failure of communication. The ERL was designed by people who believed engineering should speak for itself, that quality would be felt rather than sold. That philosophy had worked in 1986 when the first Legend arrived, because the Legend name carried weight, and the car had no direct competition. By 1996, the market was different. Buyers weren't choosing based on what the car did, they were choosing based on what owning the car said about them. The second-generation RL would eventually address this by abandoning the front-wheel drive architecture entirely, replacing it with a torque-vectoring all-wheel drive system that delivered performance dynamics closer to what the market expected from a flagship. But that fix came 10 years too late. The hierarchy had calcified. The Lexus was the luxury choice. The Acura was the logical choice. One felt like winning. The other felt like understanding engineering. What the KA9RL demonstrates is that technology cannot substitute for positioning. The car was engineered with precision that no contemporary could match. It lasted longer, rode smoother, steered with more accuracy. It was, in almost every measurable way, a more carefully built machine than its competitors. Yet it lost because it asked the market to value something the market had stopped valuing. It asked for recognition of craft in an era that had already moved on to recognition of arrival. There's another car facing the same institutional snobbery. A Corvette with the lap times to beat a Porsche and the engineering to win at Le Mans twice. Yet the automotive world refused to take it seriously. Click the next video to find out why it happened.